Because the history of evolution is that life escapes all barriers. Life breaks free. Life expands to new territories, painfully, perhaps even dangerously. But life finds a way. Welcome to this special bonus episode of the Book Club podcast. I am Carly, and I am an elder millennial. Today, my guests are Andreen and Joelle, hosts of the Rewind Rewatch podcast. And today we are discussing Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Welcome, and tell me, what is your history with this book?
Hi, everyone. This is Andreen. I want to start off by saying that I am an avid reader, and Jurassic Park has been on my to be read list, or we like to call it the TBR list, for quite some time. But as you know, Carly, since you read a lot as well, different books will come out. Book Talk will recommend different things. Your favorite author might release something. And so over time, it kind of just kept being moved further down the list. And so when you invited us to do this podcast, I was very excited because Joelle and I have seen the movie. We talked about the movie in one of our podcast episodes. And so I was very thrilled to finally sit down and read it. It was my first go at it, but I absolutely loved it. And I'm sure I'll talk about it a lot more as we discuss it. But first read for me, but a great read.
Wonderful. Joelle?
My name is Joel. I'm also on the Rewind Rewatch podcast, and this is also my first time reading the book. This is a favorite movie of mine for sure, a movie that I've never gotten tired of watching. I'm not sure that I even knew that it was I feel like I probably did know that it was a book, but I definitely never read it before. I was pleasantly surprised by it. There was a lot of consistencies with the book and a lot of things that obviously did not make it into the movie, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But yeah, this is my first read as well.
Excellent. So I first read the book as a kid. When the movie came out, I was about 10 years old, and my dad refused to let me see it in the theater. And it's like one of the big disagreements we had in my childhood. It's what it rarely happened that I had such a disagreement with my father, but this was one of them, and it really stuck with me. So I read the book in protest because I couldn't watch the movie, and then we rented the movie eventually when it was out on video. I've read the book many times. It was one of my favorites growing up. Freshman year English class, we read Jurassic Park as one of the first books, and I was so excited, and I completely destroyed the curve. I don't know how I had any friends in high school because I got 100% correct on the test and destroyed the grading curve because I knew the book so well by then. So
good for you.
I mean, it never ever occurred to me to not answer the questions if I knew the answer.
Why would you?
Yeah, right. I appreciate your support.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, one of my favorites of all time. And then I haven't read it in, definitely more than a decade. And so coming back to it, I definitely picked up different things this time around that I want to talk about with you. So as usual, we will spoil the entire book, Jurassic Park, and the movie, and we'll start with a summary. The story opens with short descriptions about lizards biting children and babies in Costa Rica. Various doctors and scientists try to identify the lizards, and someone sends an X-ray of a specimen to paleontologist Dr. Alan Grant. He and paleobotanist Dr. Ellie Sattler are invited by Hammond to consult on Hammond's new resort on his privately owned island off the coast of Costa Rica. They pick up Donald Gennaro, an attorney for Hammond's investors, Dr. Ian Malcolm, a mathematician who specializes in chaos theory, and Dennis Nedry, the programmer who built the computer system that allows most of the park to be automated. Nedry has made a deal with the competitor to steal dinosaur embryos while he's on the island fixing bugs in the computer system. When they arrive, they are joined by Hammond's grandchildren, 11-year-old Tim and 8-year-old Lex. They take a tour of the labs and meet Dr. Henry Wu, the geneticist, who explains how dinosaur DNA is extracted from insects fossilized in amber, repaired with powerful computers, and grown in artificial eggs.
Grant, Sattler, Malcolm the kids, and Ed Regis, who is the PR director of the park, take a tour in driverless electric vehicles that run on a track throughout the park. They get out to get a closer look at a 6 stegosaurus and meet the veterinarian, Harding. Grant then finds an egg. Malcolm has a conversation over the radio with Arnold, who is the head engineer, and Hammond, using the tracking technology to determine that 5 of the dinosaur species were actually breeding. The system then counts 37 velociraptors where there should only be 8. A big storm rolls in at the same time that Nedry shuts down the electricity. The electric cars are stalled in front of the Tyrannosaurus Rex enclosure. The kids watch a supply ship pull away from the island in the distance and see two young velociraptors on board. Nedry shut down the radios and phones, so they have no way to contact the ship or the control room. Both T-Rexes escape from the enclosure because the fences are not electrified. The big T-Rex attacks the cars, kicking the car with Tim still in it feet into a tree. Regis and Malcolm run away and hide, although Malcolm is seriously injured. Grant figures out that the T-Rex can't see him when he's not moving and gets away. When the dinosaurs are gone, Grant finds Lex and Tim. They hear Regis come out of hiding, but see him get killed by the juvenile T-Rex. They run into the park to get away.
Nedry breaks into the freezer and steals the embryos and takes a gas-powered Jeep. In the Jeep was a rocket launcher that Muldoon, a big game hunter who worked for the park, had placed there in case of emergency. Because Nedry takes the Jeep, no one can drive out to find the kids and the scientists. Nedry gets lost in the storm and becomes dinner for poisonous Dilophosaurs. Harding, Sattler, and Gennaro drive back to the control room in another gas Jeep. Muldoon and Gennaro use that Jeep to find the kids. Instead, they find Malcolm and take him back to the lodge where Harding can treat his injuries. Grant and the kids cross the fence out of the T-Rex territory and find a storage shed to sleep in. When they wake up the next morning, the power's on, but they don't have time to find a motion sensor because the big T-Rex attacks the Hadrosaurs near the storage shed. They find a raft and decide to ride it back to the lodge.
Park staff work to put the dinosaurs back into their correct paddocks. The phones are still down because of Nedry's program, so they can't call for medical help for Malcolm. Arnold discovers they are running on auxiliary power just before the electricity goes out again. They realize the electric fences were never turned on again and the velociraptors have escaped. Arnold tries to go to a maintenance shed to manually restart the system but gets caught by the velociraptors. Grant and the kids ride the raft into the pterosaur aviary, where they are attacked by the flying dinosaurs. Then they pass by the Dilophosaurs, practicing a mating ritual that gets interrupted by the big T-Rex. The big T-Rex tracks Grant and the kids until they come to a waterfall. Muldoon manages to shoot a tranquilizer dart into the T-Rex, although he doesn't know it's hunting Grant and the kids. The T-Rex gets knocked out just before he eats Tim, who's hiding behind the waterfall.
Harding, Sattler, and Malcolm are in Malcolm's room at the lodge, watching velociraptors chew through the steel bars above the skylight. Muldoon and Gennaro try to get to the maintenance shed to turn on the electricity, but the velociraptors find them. Muldoon hides in a pipe and Gennaro runs away. Grant finds a young male velociraptor in a tunnel, along with a gas vehicle, and drives back with the kids to the visitor center. When they arrive, they find a dead security guard and use his radio to talk to the others in the lodge. They tell Grant that he needs to turn on the electricity and reset the computer system. The kids stay in the cafeteria to find food while Grant goes to the maintenance shed. A raptor finds the kids and Tim manages to trap it in the freezer. Grant finds an injured Gennaro in the maintenance shed surrounded by compies, which are little scavenger dinosaurs. They turn on the electricity and go back to the visitors center.
Back at the lodge, Sattler goes out to the fence to keep the velociraptors distracted so that they don't attack Grant. But Wu notices that the raptors seem to just be playing with Sattler. So Wu goes to call her inside, and one of the raptors on the roof grabs him. Ellie Sattler runs to another part of the building, but the raptors don't chase her, they just go towards the visitor center. Tim and Lex go to the control center to restart the computer system, and 3 raptors jump to the second floor balcony to find them. Grant and Gennaro come to the rescue. Grant uses powerful poisons in the hatching area to poison eggs and teases the raptors into eating them. Tim then figures out how to start the computer system and turns on the electric fences just as the raptors were about to get through the skylight in the lodge. They call back the ship before it docks, and the crew finds the juvenile raptors there and kills them. Hammond goes for a walk and falls into a ravine. He injures his leg, so he can't climb back up the walking path, and no one can hear him calling for help. As he struggles to get back up the hill, a group of compies surround him and start eating him.
Grant, Sattler, Gennaro, and Muldoon tag the young male raptor that Grant found to follow it to the nest. They need to count the eggs to figure out if raptors have gotten off the island. They fall into an underground nest with 2 grown raptors and a crowd of juveniles and infants. The raptors notice when the ship comes back and anticipate boarding the ship to migrate. Grant is observing the migratory formation of the raptors on the beach when the Costa Rican military arrives in helicopters to take them off the island. The remaining survivors have already been picked up, and the military bombs the island as they fly away. Grant learns that animals have been tracked moving into the jungle where they would be very difficult to find. So that last part is completely new, not in the movie. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. But my favorite difference between the movie and the book is how Hammond is treated. And halfway through the book, the electricity is out. Arnold's trying to fix it. They're still looking for Nedry, I think. And Hammond and Wu have a conversation about the future of the park. And Hammond says, Jurassic Park's really made for children. The children of the world love dinosaurs, and the children are going to just delight in this place. The little faces will shine with the joy of finally seeing these wonderful animals. But I'm afraid I may not live to see it, Henry. I may not live to see the joy on their faces. Quote really stood out to me because at this moment, his very own grandchildren are out in the park, and Hammond has had no interest in seeing the delight on the faces of his very own grandchildren as they see dinosaurs, real life dinosaurs, for the first time. So I wanted to start there and talk a little bit about Hammond and his villain role in the book. Really, I've come to think of him as he's the real villain of the story, and just that dynamic of Hammond in the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like Hammond in the book and Hammond in the film are both equally responsible, I guess. You could argue that Nedry's responsible, I guess, but he is equally delusional, I would say. And one of the things that stands out, I think, even more in the book is the level of his delusion. Because there's multiple times throughout the story where people on his team, people who work in the park, are like noting like different things that need to be troubleshot, I guess is the right phrase. Things that need to be corrected. And he just basically brushes them off. Not to mention Dr. Malcolm, who's telling him repeatedly over and over, like, this is a bad idea. This is not going to work. And even when everything kind of falls apart and they're like stuck in this shed and they're hiding from the raptors and he can't find his grandchildren, he still is like continually trying to justify why he's doing this. And even down to the last moments where he's about to die, he keeps thinking in his head, oh man, I shouldn't have hired Wu. He wasn't good enough. And I shouldn't have hired Arnold. And if only I had done it differently, or if only I had different people on my team. And it's like, he still really hasn't come to terms with the fact that this was a bad idea. Yeah, I wonder what you guys made of that. And like, why do you think he just doesn't get it still?
Well, I kind of thought of him as a very juvenile character, because even when we're talking about, at one point, you know, he invites Dr. Sattler and Dr. Grant and Malcolm over into the island, and he's making it seem as though it's this fun, like, jam-packed weekend getaway to come see my island and enjoy the dinosaurs, when in reality he's being investigated. Like, the whole reason why they're there is because, you know, one of the raptors had gotten out and it basically sliced and diced a number of construction workers. And there's a lot of concern that what they're doing isn't exactly, you know, maybe not legal, but morally right and or safe. And it's like he seems to just completely disregard the fact that this is not a fun vacation. And he's like sitting in a chair, swinging his legs. And like, just picturing him in the book, he seemed like a child getting ready to have this fun play date with his friends. And it's like, this is a very serious matter. He doesn't seem to quite get it. Going back to Carly's question about, you know, the grandchildren and why they were there, I did find it odd that you would bring your grandchildren on this particular weekend when there's an investigation happening and people have died. So already it's like this disconnect. Like, why did you think it was okay to bring your grandchildren here? And I'm sure if their parents knew what was going on, they would not have allowed it. So that definitely was like, I don't understand why he did that. And then if it's so safe and you want to see the look on their faces, why aren't you with them to see the look on their faces? It just, I don't know. He like, this guy, the way that he does things just really blew my mind, because I just couldn't quite get his motivation behind a lot of things that he did.
Well, you talk about the grandchildren, and I think that was another departure from the film, because number one, they kind of swapped who was the eldest. So in the movie, right, Lex is older than Tim, or at least she's taller. In this book, he is around, I guess, 11, and she's like 7, and she's like very juvenile. But Tim also seems to be a pretty mature 11. even not only the fact that like he knows so much about the dinosaurs, but also in the way that he's able to essentially like help fix the computers, and he gets him out of a lot of jams as an 11-year-old boy. And that's a side that we don't really see from him in the film. And Lexi, I actually kind of found Lex a little bit annoying at certain points of the movie, or the movie. I'm talking about the movie. In the book, it felt like a movie as I was reading it. But yeah, like I feel like she wasn't scared enough. You're a 7-year-old girl surrounded by these killer dinosaurs. You've seen people get murdered before your very eyes, but she still was like trying to like make fun of her brother and trying to play with certain things. It's like, this is kind of a life or death situation. I don't feel like a 7-year-old would be reacting that way. Like they'd probably just be like balled up in a corner crying. But she was still like on playtime at certain points where I was like, girl, please listen to what Grant is telling you.
Well, she's just like her grandfather, right?
Yeah, actually that's actually a good comparison.
They just want to have a good time.
Yeah, I really like that they aged up Lex and gave her the computer knowledge in the movie, because I really don't know what purpose 7-year-old Lex was serving in the book. She was just an annoying package that Grant had to deliver to safety at some point. But there are moments where like they just escaped, or when they're on the raft and the T-Rex is hunting them and they're trying to be super quiet, and she starts to cough and she's like, I didn't mean it. Actually, I mean, I don't have kids, so I don't know for sure, but that felt like a very true to life, like kids just not really understanding the consequences of their actions and being very self-centered, like especially younger kids, of like, no, I had a tickle in my throat and I had to cough, and it doesn't matter that there's a T-Rex over there that we're hiding from, you know?
But there are also parts where she's like just not listening to Grant, who's very clearly the adult that's keeping you alive. And I'm like, girl, please just get it together. And you can see him kind of getting annoyed by it. And then, which is also a bit of a departure from the film, where he's like very anti-children at the beginning, and he has some kid in at one of his dig sites, and he basically scares him with this story about how raptors would slice him open. And then by the end, he's like saving the children, and it's a very nice change of his character development. Whereas in the book, he like takes to the kids immediately, and then obviously goes on to save them, and they have a much longer adventure with the waterfall and the raft and all this other stuff. But I thought that was like interesting, the way that they framed him as a little bit more of a curmudgeon in the movie.
He says that little kids like dinosaurs because they are like parents. They're just big and powerful, and that they're like parents, and that's theory of why kids like dinosaurs. I wonder if
more sense for the movie to paint him in that way, because this way there was some kind of character arc, whereas in the book I just feel like he came into it, he even says that he loves kids, so it's like, okay, I love kids, there's kids, I'm gonna immediately take to them, they have this great relationship, he saves them. But it just seemed like, I don't know, I didn't really get a lot of character development from really any of them. Like, I feel like they kind of all came in with one way and they left the same way. I mean, by the end, I guess Hammond realized how dangerous they were because they ended up murdering him. But I mean,
I would argue that there is a part. Get it?
Well, at the part towards the end, he does make a statement to Malcolm about how he's worried if the dinosaurs get off of the island, they'd be able to destroy the world. He does say that. So at one point, he does realize it is dangerous. It's very close to the end of the book, but he does somewhat have a change. But I feel like everyone else is just kind of just existing along the same way they started. So I did like the fact that the movie added some nuance that wasn't quite there in the book.
You know what, though? I feel like you're right. Like, there wasn't a lot of character development, but I didn't necessarily even notice as I was reading it. And I think if I'm watching a movie or a drama series, I certainly look for that with a little bit more of a critical eye. But with this book, I was just kind of just, yo, what's going to happen next? And I'm just looking at the action of it. What I wasn't really paying as much attention to the development of the characters. It was more so like, how are they going to get out of this jam? And then once it ends, it's like there's something else that comes right behind it. So I thought the way that the book was written was very action packed, and it like kept my attention It starts off kind of scientific, actually, where like there's a lot of explaining. There's like probably 100 pages of exposition, but once it goes, it starts going pretty fast.
Yeah, I think so. I try to talk about genre on this podcast, and so this is a different genre than any of the books I've read before on the podcast. And I was looking at thriller and the attributes of a thriller book, and character development is not necessary. It's having a deadline, right? The counting clock is a big trope in thriller, and then having a lot of bloody death can be another component of that. I think it's interesting in this book that the killers are extinct dinosaurs and not like a murderer or a psychopath or something. So yeah, it's a new realization in this read through that like, yeah, wait a minute, none of the characters do actually develop. Is there a pattern, do you think, of the characters who get eaten? Is there like a moral component to like which characters get eaten and which characters survive? Because it seems like even Wu, the geneticist, has some moments of, oh, we should create domesticated dinosaurs and we should destroy the really dangerous dinosaurs. And Hammond is very much against that. Like there's something with Hammond, he likes the power of the dinosaurs, but he doesn't respect the power. I think that's part of it, is that he wants the power to belong to himself in a way and make him money, and he doesn't really respect the power, which I would say Grant does, having loved and studied dinosaurs his whole career. So is there a pattern there of like which characters respect the power of dinosaurs, and are those the ones that get to survive?
Well, I would say no, because Malcolm ends up dying.
Or does he?
He definitely dies in this book, and then he's miraculously brought back to life in the next book.
Which is so bizarre. But yeah, I mean, in this book, I'll say that Malcolm dies, and it could be argued that out of everyone in the book, Malcolm was the one with the most respect for dinosaurs and for nature as a whole. And he's constantly warning Hammond that this is not a good idea. The park is going to have to get shut down. And Hammond, of course, is completely against this. He just cannot understand why Malcolm does not share this vision. And there's one thing about Hammond that I wanted to bring up, and it's not something that's mentioned at all in the movie, but when they're describing who Hammond is and the way he's able to get investors to even open up this park, they tell this story about how Hammond is walking around with this like tiny little elephant, and it's like a 9-inch high, 1 foot long elephant that he keeps in a cage. And he would basically bring this thing around to fundraising meetings to talk about, different prospects for developing consumer biologicals. And I'm reading the book and I'm just picturing this older man walking around with this tiny little elephant, and I'm laughing to myself because it's like, this is the most showy thing you can possibly do, to be walking around to investors with a little elephant in the cage. And it goes to show that like he's telling people like, yeah, this is what I can do with my new, genetic biological stuff. But he fails to mention to them that like the elephant was not actually made from any genetic procedure. It was already like a dwarf elephant embryo that was raised. So it's like he starts off lying to people, and he does this to basically just put forth his plans to make this park with these dinosaurs. And he completely disregards the fact that you have poisonous dinosaurs that can shoot poison to a range of 50 feet, which is like, why would I even want to have this type of dinosaur in my park? You have velociraptors, which are intelligently smart. They can learn how to work handles and
they
open
work
doors. And
Right.
and they hunt in packs, which is very dangerous. And I believe the book mentions at some point that like when they're creating these dinosaurs and they're basically binding together their DNA, they are not sure what kind of dinosaur they're going to create until the dinosaur comes out. And my thought was, okay, I understand maybe at the breeding part you don't really know what's going on, but once the dinosaur comes out and you see that it's a velociraptor, or you see that it's the Dilophosaurus that can shoot poison, like, do you allow the dinosaur to keep growing to its full adult height, or do you say maybe we shouldn't have these kind of dinosaurs here and stick to just the herbivore and get rid of these dangerous dinosaurs? And of course, John Hammond sees it as, we want to have the most amazing park, so we want everything here. But reading it, I was like, why would I just not just get rid of the ones that are dangerous?
So then they would have been like, oh, this this baby comes out the shell and it's Dilophosaur, and then you're like, oh, we just created Dilophosaur, and then you just kill it.
Well, once you know the DNA sequence for the species, then you don't have to create anymore, right? But like, yeah, so like once
Right.
the Dilophosaurs reach a point where it's apparent that they're spitting poison, then you destroy the ones that are alive, and you stop making new ones. So yeah, I don't know.
Didn't they say something in the book too about how they were like they had explored the option of removing the venom sac? I don't remember what the reason was why they didn't do it.
Yeah, so they tried to do it, but apparently they couldn't quite figure out where the sacs were located in the dinosaurs.
So they were just like, well, we tried.
Well, no, they wanted to they would need to dissect. They would need a full dissection of a dead Dilophosaur, and Hammond refused to let them kill a Dilophosaur to do that.
Yeah. So this is what I'm saying, and like this guy, man, it's just it felt like there was a complete delusion, and you know, one of the conversations that we had, you know, before we started recording was like this whole thing about the humans in this book. Were they just like silly, incompetent idiots? Or was it something else at play? Because for me, it almost felt like there was this air of arrogance, not only in Hammond, but at various points also Wu, also Arnold. And really, I mean, frankly, there was also a bit of arrogance from Malcolm as well. He just was right. But I think that was one of the biggest reasons why Hammond just really didn't like him, is because he also didn't like somebody coming into his space and telling him why he was wrong. And everybody else who's in his space are basically his employees. So whatever he says pretty much goes. And Malcolm was like, no, that doesn't work for me. So I think, anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track, but I think the original question is more so like, were these people just stupid, or was it the fact that they were too arrogant to see where their flaws were?
I think it's arrogance.
I think with Hammond, it's very clearly arrogance. I think with with Arnold and Wu, I don't think it's as clear. Like, just to go, so there's a lot of like thoughtlessness going on, and that beginning part of the story, that's a lot like Joel, you said exposition going on in the beginning. This time, when I was reading it, it really irritated me. There were these moments of someone found a lizard on the beach and it bit a child, and they tested the venom, but they couldn't figure it out, and they like leave off information when they're reporting to other agencies and scientists to try to help them solve this mystery. Like every step of the way, someone is like, no, it can't be that, so I just won't share that piece of information. That must be a mistake. Like one of them, they find a piece of Compy carcass and they send it for genetic testing, and the lab that does the genetic testing finds the marker that marks it as a genetically engineered animal. That, like, you know, there was some policy put in place, maybe it's legal policy, that says if you're genetically engineering an animal, put this marker in place so people know. Well, then people find the carcass and they test it and they find it and they assume it's a lab error, and so they dismiss that. Like all of these little things. So I'm gonna keep going. In the park, the electricity goes out, and Arnold talks to everyone in the control room, and he's like, we have these radios, they're for emergencies. Of course, no one has charged them. And that, I was like, are you kidding me? No one charged the emergency radios? But all of these little things, I think Crichton does a really good job of just slipping those in the story, of like just this thoughtlessness. And I think it goes, I mean, Joel, you've used the word hubris, and I think that's definitely part of it, that it's a special kind of hubris that especially is it affects intelligent people, right? People who think that they're smart enough to have thought through all the contingencies, and therefore have even bigger blind spots, right? That, you know, they think they're too smart to have things go wrong. And then of course, no one is too smart to have things go wrong. And that has really stuck with me a lot. Like as growing up, at like feeling like no one is exempt from the worst possible thing to happen. I wonder if I learned that from this book when I read it when I was like 14 years old, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even like touching on what you were saying about how they didn't have, you know, certain things in place. When they were talking about how they were counting the different animals in the park, right? Initially, I believe Hammond had said that he was going to have like 12 different animals in the park, but he ends up with, which is like, you did way more than you said you were going to do. And then the how they used to count the different animals in the park. The problem is they were counting a number based on what they think they had. So like if the number dropped below the 238, they would automatically know. But the animals started breeding, which they thought couldn't be done because they were all supposed to be females. When the animals started breeding, they had no idea this was going on because their count wasn't putting into account the fact that the number might possibly go up. So that was like a whole thing where it's like, were you guys even, well, they weren't concerned about it, number one. And then number two, I believe that the cameras that they have were only set up in like 92% of the park. So there still was 8% where they had no idea what was going on. They couldn't see if the compies were going out there. They couldn't see if there were other eggs being hatched out there. And they just kind of a shoulder shrug, like, oh, yeah, it'll be fine. Like, oh, they can't possibly be out there. And it's like, why aren't you guys taking the time to see how serious this is? And it goes back to my earlier point. If you had all like herbivores, then it wouldn't be that much of a big deal. Like, okay, it's a dinosaur, but it can't possibly hurt anyone. But you have very dangerous things here. And it's like, apart from, yes, Wu did come back and, mention having docile animals, but I feel like they all like, even like Robert Muldoon, who's the park warden, it's like, why, like you said, why aren't we making sure that things are charged, that we have more than one strong weapon that can fight these dinosaurs? Like,
it really doesn't make any sense. And I also think a big part of it was that they're doing a rush job. And it's also just like greed and capitalism at play, because the whole point of this park is really just to make money. Like, it doesn't really have anything to do with seeing the beautiful smiles on the children's faces. Like, this is just some nonsense that he puts together for whatever reason. But, to Carly's point, he's not even with his grandchildren. So whatever smiles that was on their faces, he didn't see them. So really, this is all just like, let me see how much money I can make from people who want to see dinosaurs, which, yeah, sure, they will want to see dinosaurs, but you're rushing to get this park opened. The only reason that you're basically being investigated because they're like, we invested mad money in this and now we're not even sure that it's going to even be open. So like, despite all of this, you would think, okay, the lawyer's coming, the investor's coming, I got these doctors, this pathologist, like, I'm going to have everything buttoned up. But it's like, no, he still doesn't. Despite all of these people coming to investigate your park to make sure that it's actually still legitimate enough to be able to be opened, he still is carrying on in a very nonchalant manner, as if like, oh, once they see the dinosaurs, they'll be so blown away that they'll just stop asking me questions. Like, it didn't really make any sense for someone who's an accomplished businessman who's in like his 70s, like, childish is the word I think Andreen used, and that's like spot on for me.
So Malcolm, this read through, I had a very different reaction to Malcolm than I have in the past. Like, it seemed to, like, I wonder if he doesn't quite fit the sort of like respecting, if we're dividing characters into who respects the power of the dinosaurs and who doesn't. I don't know that Malcolm actually fits into that respecting column. It's like, it seemed to me the way he spoke felt very much like a certain kind of Twitter user who likes to lecture people,
So a Twitter user.
Sure. Yeah. I'm trying to see if I can find a quote specifically. Oh, yes. There's at one point where he says, in the information society, nobody thinks. We expected to banish paper, but we banish thought. Like, that could be a tweet. And it's not, I thought that was smart previous times I've read this, but now I'm just like, oh, come on. Like, what are you're just talking to talk. You just want to hear your own voice. It's not clear whether he actually knew that they were trying to make a dinosaur park before they arrived. I'm not really sure. Because he does ask when he sees a dinosaur, he's like, that's not animatronic, is it? He just knew that Hammond wanted to do this big brand new park, and his mathematical models told him it wouldn't work, and it seemed like he just wanted to infuriate Hammond and prove himself right. So I don't know how much moral credit I give him. I mean, he says a lot of interesting things and thoughtful things, but I don't know that necessarily makes him like a good character. Like Grant, I would say, is a good person. So
you're not Team Malcolm.
no, I'm Team Jeff Goldblum. I'm not Team Malcolm.
That's two different things completely.
So on your point, I can see what you're saying, because I found another quote where he says, "Discovery is the rape of the natural world," right?
I was actually just about to bring up this entire page here. So yeah, keep
oh
now,
wow.
keep going.
So when you read that quote, on the one hand, it's like, yes, like scientists have done some really outrageous and really harmful things over the years in order to, advance our knowledge of how the world works, how the planet works, how animals grow, and all of that. But I actually read a whole book about this, and it's interesting because on the one hand, it's like we have all these great discoveries, and it's really good that we were able to figure this out. But then it's like, but at what cost, right? It's like, for instance, like if you want to go really dark and talk about, different testing they've done on different humans to see, how long a human could withstand being exposed to carbon dioxide or things of that nature. It's like, this is really bad, and we clearly shouldn't be killing people or animals in order to test this thing. But then the flip side of it is like, well, because of these tests, we now know X, Y, and Z. So it's not as black and white as Malcolm makes it seem. But it does prompt a good conversation, because it's like, yes, you do want to advance and you do want to be able to accomplish all these things. But Malcolm's question is more like, well, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, which I think is a great thought. And, it definitely, when it comes to Hammond, is something that's very important, because it's like, yes, you did all these dinosaurs, but like, really, should we be doing this?
I feel like a lot of times when I read a book or I watch a movie, there's usually a character that it provides almost like the moral compass for the storyline. And it oftentimes comes off to me as like the author using this person as a proxy of like getting out all of their ideas and like their stance on XYZ thing. And as I was reading Jurassic Park, it did feel Crichton was like using Malcolm to kind of be like his mouthpiece to give his thoughts against like the concept of cloning, which was happening in the early 90s, or his thoughts against like, science imposing itself on nature. And some of these monologues that Malcolm goes on are really, as Andreen said, like thought-provoking and kind of like gives a different way of looking at things. And, maybe he doesn't believe any of this and he's just a very creative writer, but it did come off to me as like, this is him trying to like hit the reader with a message to be like, hey, look, this is kind of the point of this story, and I'm going to make sure that at the end of the day, Malcolm is correct, which obviously he is. But, going back to the quote that you were talking about discovery, like he goes in, I actually made a note of these pages 317 to 319, because he just goes on this epic rant as he's like super high on morphine and on the edge of death. But he goes on this rant where he's basically saying that like people who are scientists who have this, this school developed intelligence are always constantly thinking about ways to push the limits of what they know and what they understand in order to create the next big thing, or in order to have the next discovery. But almost kind of like this is all kind of rooted in people's own self-interest and not really thinking about like the effect that all of their testing and discovery has. And it felt very much to me that he is kind of using some of these monologues throughout the book to kind of be like, yo, this is actually trash, and this is actually a microcosm of a bigger issue, because obviously nobody's cloning dinosaurs in real life, but I'm really trying to point the finger at the concept of animal cloning and the concept of like science for discovery's sake.
That definitely seems true. I do want to bring up there's a conversation that Arnold has with Gennaro, and I like until this read through I always associated this conversation with Malcolm, but I was like, oh, wait a minute, Malcolm's not in this conversation. It's Arnold who talks about the difference between a mechanical system and a living system. And he makes the point that a living system is constantly changing and always on the brink of collapse. That is something that has stuck with me my whole life, of thinking about when things feel chaotic, or like that it's just the way life works, that like temperature is constantly changing, your body temperature is constantly changing, you're always evaluating and responding to the situation. And that's what living systems do. There's always just so much input, and then the living system responds to whatever is going on, and it's always on the brink of collapse. And that also feels like a lecture direct from Crichton, right? But he's disagreeing with Malcolm. He's saying, Malcolm, mathematicians are talking about mechanics, and this is a living system. And it's interesting because it's also kind of this, like Malcolm's saying with chaos theory, you're incorporating the idea of unpredictability, but Arnold is saying it doesn't matter in a living system, because a living system will respond and bring things back into equilibrium.
Maybe this is like getting too philosophical, but I think it also like starts to ask the question about, I guess, like the stability of instability, right? There is like, you really can't control everything. And even if you could, then that system by proxy then kind of becomes unhealthy, because then it's not like living things kind of have to screw up, because that's the way that life continues to evolve. And by trying to like put these two stringent conditions on life, you're either going to fail, which is the most likely option, or B, like you're going to automate it so much so that it no longer becomes real life.
I love that you use the word automate. I mean, I love everything you just said, but speaking of automation, like one of the major weaknesses of Jurassic Park is that they want things to be automated, and that's repeated over and over again, and that's why Nedry was hired. So this maybe is a segue. Angie, did you want to say something about Nedry?
Oh boy, do I.
I just also want to note before you go on that because I've seen this film multiple times, like as I'm watching this, I'm just picturing like Samuel L. Jackson and Sam Neill, and I'm picturing all these people as I'm reading the book. So I'm certainly seeing Newman from Seinfeld as every time the name Nedry gets mentioned. So, but go ahead.
So it's funny because when you say that, I feel like for Grant and Sattler, I kind of was trying to picture different characters, but Nedry's always going to be Newman. Like that's for sure who Nedry is. So one of the big flaws with the park is that I believe Hammond said that it has minimal personnel and it can be run by only 20 people, which obviously
insane. It cannot be run by 20 people.
Well, like why you want that small of a staff, God only knows. And you have one person who is Nedry, who's in charge of the, computer system. Nedry, they describe him in the book as being like this overweight person who's like constantly eating candy bars for some reason.
Candy bars are good.
So you just see like this, he's just, kind of like a slob is how they describe him. And he is basically the computer project supervisor. He is the only person that knows how to operate all of the computer systems, which as we see is a huge problem because he gets approached by this other company to basically give them the embryos of different types of dinosaurs in exchange for a huge payout. And the reason why Nedry even agrees to this is because he feels as though he's been underpaid and overworked by Hammond. The book does go into a little bit of detail explaining that he went ahead and set it up the way he was told to, and then he was later on told that he had to do additional work. And when he pushed back and asked for money to do the additional work, he was told by, I believe, Engine is the company that Hammond runs. Engine basically was like, no, you're going to do this work without the additional pay. So he's already kind of annoyed. And then when he gets approached, I'm trying to see the name of the company. Lewis Dotson. Thank you. Yeah, Lewis Dotson is one of the geneticists at Biosin. And so, he finds out what Engine is doing, and he's like, okay, if we can get examples of these dinosaurs, then we can then reverse engineer them and then make their own with enough modifications to the DNA so that they can basically avoid the Engine's patents. So at this point, they're thinking if we can get what they're doing, it can be like a race. We can do our own stuff. We can still make money, because if Engine becomes successful in what they're doing, Biosyn's going to lose out. And basically, Dodson meets Nedry, and in the book, he talks about how he's been working on him for 6 months. So apparently, there's been multiple meetings or conversations between the two, and he realizes that Nedry's, this, upset
Disgruntled
um,
employee.
employee of the company, and I believe he stands to gain like, what was it, $1.5 million for the embryos of 15 species, which, I mean, that's crazy money. And so Nedry decides, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get this money out and get these things out and get the money. And I mean, on the one hand, you can kind of see that he feels like, I'm underappreciated. Hammond doesn't really care about me as an employee. He overworks me. Nobody cares about me. And also, like, the park just isn't really well put together. But what confused me about Nedry is, okay, so you turn everything off. So now the gates aren't working. You're basically allowing the dinosaurs to get out. We know the dinosaurs somehow are breeding, although we thought they couldn't, but they can. They're out, and you're deciding you're gonna run around in the park to get down to the dock and
In
steal
a
these
storm.
embryos and leave. Yeah, it starts raining like crazy, and he gets turned around. He gets lost. He can't figure out where he is, and he gets out of the car. He sees a dinosaur. It's one of the smaller ones, and instantly, as people who've read the book, like, we know certain dinosaurs, can spit poison, this, that, and the other. We also learned earlier on in the book, when the dinosaurs were out, biting other kids, that there's poison. My thing is, if Nedry works at the park, would I not try to figure out what dinosaurs are here? Like, wouldn't I would be privy to this information. So wouldn't I make it my point to be like, okay, I'm going to turn off these gates in order to escape. Let me make sure that I'm going the route of where the herbivores are. You know what I mean? Like, why am I getting out of the car? I'm seeing this dinosaur. I have no idea what kind of dinosaur it is. He gets sprayed in the face with poison, and he's like shocked by it. And I'm like, you don't know what kind of dinosaur is in front of you right now? I just couldn't understand, like, why he doesn't have more knowledge about
That
the
wasn't his
animals in the
job.
park.
And you answered the question earlier, because you basically said he's running this entire park with 20 people. They're all overworked. So if he's spending, 14 hours a day working on this system of how to basically operate the park from a computer, he's not going to be taking time during his lunch break to be like, let me go learn about dinosaurs. So he doesn't actually know anything about the science. He's just there to work the security system. And he's basically created the whole thing from scratch and is the only one who knows how to do it. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good answer, but like, I think that's why.
No, it's the same. It's the same hubris. I mean, it's interesting you point out how Hammond treated Nedry, because Hammond does the same thing with everyone. He thinks that he chooses the people and he expects them to perform in exactly the way he wants, and he expects the same thing of the dinosaurs. But when they find out that there are 37 velociraptors, at that moment, why didn't everyone just get into a safe container and get the helicopters to get them the hell off that island? 37 velociraptors. 31 velociraptors are running loose around that
and
island.
Your grandchildren
and no one blinks at it.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Yeah. No, it's
really strange behavior.
Yeah, it's that same magical thinking of something this bad couldn't possibly happen because we're so smart. Mm-hmm. We've figured everything out already.
And I've spent like 5 years building this park. So I'm also just unwilling to see the fact that, this is not going to work out for me.
There's like a momentum that builds up. You have all of this money, and all this money puts this pressure on making sure this happens. And then all this money, and then all this time. And then this great discovery that you can actually genetically engineer dinosaurs. Like, it all just builds up this momentum and this pressure, and no one is willing to stop it. People are just too overwhelmed by all of that.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. I was thinking a little bit about your point that Hammond expects people in the company to, basically work a certain way. And I was thinking about Ed Regis. So Regis is supposed to be the head of public relations for Jurassic Park. And it turns out that he's doing all these different jobs that really don't relate to his position. So the first time we see him, it's very early in the book, and he is basically escorting this injured construction worker off the island after he was attacked by a velociraptor. And granted, that's an emergency, so someone has to do it, and he did. But then later on, you have when everyone comes to the island, he ends up being like the babysitter for Tim and Lex, and he starts complaining about it to himself because he's like, I'm the head of PR for the company. I'm not a babysitter. But that's essentially what he gets demoted to because Hammond's like, oh, my kids are here. Like, you handle it. And it's also like, these are your grandchildren. Why aren't they spending time with you? But Hammond just sees people in his company as like little minions that he can just, okay, you do this, you do that, you do this, and doesn't stop to think that maybe I should get more people here. Maybe there should be more than one person who knows how to unlock the computer system. So I'm not relying on an 11-year-old to figure out how to turn the electric fences back on. Like, the whole thing was just so ridiculous.
Tim was definitely the man, though. But speaking of the kids, like, what do you think is the reason that they're being included in this story at all? Because you could have written this book without any child characters and had a very similar story. Obviously, there's like the famous kitchen scene from the movie that's also in the book, where the children are by themselves. But theoretically, like, the terror is not so much like these children are going to get hurt. It's the fact that there are dinosaurs loose and everybody's going to die. So why do you think he decides to use these grandchildren characters at all?
Tim is a perspective character. We get a lot of the story is told from his perspective.
That's true.
Would you say even more than Grant, maybe?
I mean, Grant feels like the quote unquote main character. I mean, there's a number of different storylines happening at the same time, but that he does feel like the story A, and then everybody else is kind of like filling in the gaps. But he spends majority of the book alone with these two children.
Yeah, my first thought is Tim is the most endearing character. He's innocent. He's a child. Like, you can't blame him for anything that's going wrong. And it's like Grant is also you can't blame him for anything going wrong in the story either. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. Like, what does the perspective of a child? It brings this whole other level of innocence, and he's just like a really admirable character because he figures things out. Protects his sister, who is super annoying.
She's pretty awful.
And Tim in the movie is really endearing too. Like, I think Tim in the movie has all of the funny lines that we always quoted at each other. Like, he's just an endearing.
Well, my favorite is "Hold on to your budget." That's probably the one I quote.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because it does add a level of intrigue to the book, knowing that there are two characters that are like completely innocent. Like, Grant and Sattler are certainly innocent as well, but they did show up on this island voluntarily, although they didn't really know what they were showing up to. So I guess they are fully innocent because he's not really even forthcoming with them about what this island is. But in any event, I think with having two children, maybe it adds a little bit more higher stakes of like, you don't want to see two innocent kids get mauled by a T-Rex. And so then it's like, you're actually a little bit more invested in seeing them get away versus a room full of adults, where you're like, you still want them to live, but like, if they don't, then it's like, all right, well, you don't feel as bad about it as a reader.
There's a moment of horror where the T-Rex is destroying the car that the kids were in, and Grant can hear the kids screaming, but he can't see very well what's going on, and he hears Lex screaming, and then she's not screaming anymore, and it's just like, oh, that moment of horror. I'd like to move on to genre themes if we're ready to.
Let's do it.
Yep.
All right. So the genre we're talking about is millennial nostalgia, and I think for the most part the movie has a bigger role in millennial nostalgia than the book does. But again, they do have a lot in common. And the main genre theme we've talked about is connection. How do we connect? Especially since millennials had a childhood for the most part where there wasn't an internet connection, and then learned how to connect to each other over the internet, and now social media is such a huge part of connecting, and right now we're talking over the internet. so is there anything that the story tells us about connection? I mean, I would say in the there's a love of dinosaurs that Grant shares with Tim, and so there's a connection there.
Well, I'm going to actually go back to something that you mentioned earlier about the way that Malcolm Speaks is like a know-it-all Twitter user. And I made a joke about how people talk on Twitter, but I think there's a larger point to be made in terms of effective communication. I think when we talk about the bad side of the internet, right, and like this social media era that we're in, where people are kind of just like talking at each other. And I think especially when we talk a lot about Gen Z and like the internet mixed with the pandemic has led generations younger than us to have less ability to connect on a human level. And I think a big part of that has to do with being able to relate and communicate to one another. This is obviously not the same thing because this book was written in the 90s, but I do think that there is a connection there between how we in today's day and age, oftentimes it feels like we are missing the mark when we're trying to make points with one another, whether that's on Twitter or whether that's political discourse or just being able to kind of communicate and understand each other's perspectives. That is like rampant in this book, right? People are constantly, Malcolm and Hammond are kind of the templates for it. But even the other characters are oftentimes not really making the points that they're trying to make to one another. And Crichton does this thing where he will have the characters dialogue and then he'll say like, this is actually what's going on in Wu's head and this is what's happening in Sattler's head, to give us more of a comprehension of what they're thinking and their line of thinking. But there does seem to be a disconnect when you talk about genuine connection with one another. I think one of the parts of the reasons why they fail to have genuine connection is because the communication is poor and also because people aren't really listening to each other.
I have so much more to say about that.
I was like,
I'm starting to think now of like, yeah, no, it's, I wonder too if you're talking about communication, maybe just like when Sattler is at the fence trying to distract the raptors and then Wu is watching and he's like, I think the raptors are trying to distract her. Like that kind of communication and that the chilling effect it has that these creatures, these extremely powerful creatures with very sharp claws, have that level of communication, like that's terrifying. And is it because of how many millions of years of evolution that separate humans and dinosaurs? Like that is, there's no way to breach that. Like you can't domesticate a dinosaur like you would a dog, although Wu seems, maybe Wu could speed that along. I don't know. The next genre theme is female characters, and do we have good examples of female characters? I mean, Ellie is awesome.
She's great. I mean, although I will say that the way that she's described is great. I like the way that she's written in the sense that she knows her stuff. And I believe when she's described in the novel, there's a part where they say that she's not a woman who's disposed to unnecessary panic. So it's like she knows her stuff. She would be well equipped to deal with the situation more than a regular person who doesn't really know, dinosaurs and plants and all that. But I found that the way that she was treated wasn't always the best. Like, for instance, when she first meets Gennaro, he makes a comment like, "Oh, you're a woman," and she says like, "Oh, these things happen," with a shrug, which made me laugh because it's like, this is what we have to do. It's like if you're a woman, a lot of times in certain areas of work, like you know what it's like where people are surprised when you show up and you're not you're not the receptionist, you're actually the boss. Like there's this idea that if you hear doctor, well, it must be a man, So I did like the fact that she kind of came back from it very quickly and was like not, nonplussed. But even when Malcolm starts talking to her, there's a part where he comes in, he's wearing like all black, and she makes a comment like, "It's so hot outside. Why are you wearing all black?" And his response is like, "Oh, you have beautiful legs. I can look at them all day long." And I was like, "What? Why? Why did he say this?" But again, it's like, she's the woman character. So there's a lot of times where, they have these men who are hitting on her, saying inappropriate things. Whereas that wasn't happening in the movie version, at least not that I recall. I know that Malcolm was like interested in her, but I don't remember it being a situation where he said something inappropriate about her legs.
That's probably
no,
for
but
the
she
better.
has that line. She has that line. Malcolm's talking about God creates dinosaurs. This is quoted a lot, I think, growing up. God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man creates dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, or man creates dinosaurs. And then Ellie says, "Dinosaurs eat man. Woman inherits the earth." Like she's definitely representing the '90s feminist in the movie, and it makes me think that was really good because, like you said, the preconception that you hear doctor and you imagine a man. Did Dr. Ellie Sattler help us as kids to broaden our expectation of when we think of a scientist and when we think of a doctor and a competent person? Did it help us broaden that? Because I don't know. I'd like to say yes, maybe. There's also a doctor in this story, a medical doctor, who treats or tries to treat the young man who's killed by the raptor.
I kind of forgot about all of those people. But yeah, that is there is a lot more outside of the park in the setup of the book, and then once we get to the park, we don't leave again.
Yeah, and I also think as far as the movie switch versus the book, so in the book, Lex was really annoying, mostly because of the fact that she was just very young, and she seemed to be like a young 7 or 8 year old. Like she just had, not enough terror, in my opinion. But in the movie, since they aged her up, Lex was the one who knew how to hack into the computer system, and she was the one who was able to turn the power back on in the movie version. So I definitely think that they made a strong female child role in the movie, which was good to see because, again, now it's gotten better, but you think about computer programmers back in the 90s, like I would just think, oh, that's what like quote unquote nerdy guys do. You don't really think that it would be a girl or a woman who would be able to hack into the system and knew a lot about computers. So I did like that nice flip in the movie to have Lex be the one who could figure the system out.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's really only 2 female characters in the book. So yeah, I think, yeah, there's definitely a little bit of that misogyny at the beginning, but so much of the book is based on them trying to survive that I think everybody's kind of relying on each other's skills. And again, because the park is so adequately staffed, you really only have one person that knows whatever specific thing you need. And so like she's kind of the only, or anyone even similar that knows about plants there. So there's a certain amount of like required reliance that happens just based on the fact that nobody else knows what anybody else there knows. But yeah, that's probably all I really have to say about that.
Does this story reflect the claim from One in a Millennial, which was the first book we read for this season, that millennials were raised for a world that no longer exists? I mean, did this book have less? Well, first of all, the first part of the book makes the claim that genetic power is going to change society in the way that industrial power changed society, and I don't know if that's true. Like, do we think that I mean, it's hard to say.
I mean, when I think about just what's been going on lately in terms of, scientific development, and we're not talking about I'm not talking about genetics per se, but even something like, AI, right? And you think about like this actor strike that happened because they wanted to use people's images and likeness, essentially without using the actors themselves. And it can be kind of scary when you think about it. Like nowadays, going back to social media, it's like you'll click on a picture of something and it's like, wait, did someone actually take a picture of this, or is this an AI drawing or an AI rendering of something? It's very hard to determine what's real and what's not. And that is kind of scary because it's like, what exactly am I looking at? Can I trust this source? And I don't know. I feel like so many times, even to watch a video of something, it's like people can fake videos now. So it's like, I'm seeing this person saying these things, but did they actually say this, or did someone just put this clip together? It makes for a era where I feel like I am way more distrustful of things than I was when I was younger. Because growing up, it's like if we were to watch the news or read a news article, like we knew that it was fact, right? There was really no question.
So we believed it was anyway.
Well, but generally speaking, it's like all of the news cycles reported the same thing. Like, you could flip from one channel to the next and get essentially the same type of thing. And I feel like nowadays everything is like so driven on what kind of message I want to put forward based on the different news station that I'm on. Everything is so curated. Even when you're scrolling on your social medias, everything is made for you. So I had a friend once show me a post where it was like, if we can all look at the same exact post right now in our social media, and depending on what it is you've clicked on or bought or liked, different comments will show up at the forefront for you than it will for me. So it's like we're looking at the same clip, but like you might get all positive comments and I might see all the negative ones based on how our views are, which is mind blowing to me. So it's like the internet and the way things have changed. I feel like we're definitely, as millennials, this is not the world we grew up in. Like, yes, we saw when the internet came up and we were like on AOL and we kind of started on it. But now I like seeing where it is now and where it was when we were kids. It's like, it's bizarre. And yeah, I don't think we were raised for the world that we're in now. The Gen Zers tend to, I think, thrive more in the online platform than we do. They know all the latest things, all the latest apps, how to even work computers. They grew up on computers. We had to kind of adjust and figure out how to do things. Whereas from the time that they were toddlers, they're running around with tablets in their hands.
Yes, but that doesn't teach them how to work and troubleshoot issues with the computer. I've seen that teachers have had issues with younger students that they don't know how to save a file or find a file that they've
really
saved.
They know how to search
different.
YouTube.
I mean, it's right, but it like I wonder if Jurassic Park. It's definitely in my mind a lot. Like whenever there's some new innovation announced or some like idea proposed, I feel like Jurassic Park taught us to be a little bit skeptical of like that. It's that question of just because you could doesn't mean you should. And I think that is really valuable in our social consciousness for making us think that regularly.
So I think there's two aspects to this book. One is the concept of like cloning, right? Which he writes this in 1990. We have the whole Dolly cloning that happens in 96. So I do feel like in the early 90s and even going into the mid 90s towards Y2K, like this was a conversation that was happening a lot in terms of like whether it's moral or not. But I think the other part of it that I think does reflect in modern times is the idea of how humans impose themselves on nature. So whether that's like the global warming debate, the fracking debate, a lot of the things that we're seeing people continue to argue about in today's day and age, I think a lot of those roots are still in this story in terms of like, should we be imposing ourselves on the earth around us? And if we do, are we willing to come to terms with the effects of that? And even thinking about some of the ways that the characters in this book, Hammond, chief among them, are kind of neglectful and they kind of just brush off. I think we also see that in the way that some of these things are discussed today, where like people are on different sides of it. Some people are like, this is a huge issue. And then other people kind of play it down and like, this is not really a big deal. And so I would be, obviously, Crichton's no longer with us, but I would be interested to see like if he had any quotes or thoughts around some of those man versus nature debates when he was still living. Because I feel like based on some of the quotes from Ian Malcolm, I kind of feel like I know where he would land on that.
We've talked about the movie throughout, which is, I mean, of course, the movie was so impactful. I mean, the ideas that we talked about, the lasting ideas that have impacted us, came from the book originally, expertly recreated in the movie. Is there anything else we want to say about the impact of this movie on the millennial generation?
I mean, this movie, I feel like when you look at it, I remember looking at the dinosaurs as a kid, and even now looking back at older movies, a lot of times the like CGI and stuff just looks like it's really outdated, and you kind of laugh at it because it's like we used to find this interesting or scary, but it looks crazy now. But Jurassic Park still holds up. Like when you watch this movie, it's like, oh, I'm looking at a T-Rex. I'm looking at a Velociraptor. Like they did such a good job in creating this world that when you're watching it, like you're just immersed in everything that's going on. One scene that sticks out to me, and you mentioned it earlier, was the part when Tim and Lex are in the car and the T-Rex is there, and then it spins off the edge, and then the car ends up being stuck in a tree, and then it starts falling down. Like that was actually all in the book. And reading it, I was again like playing it out in my mind in the movie, and I'm like, this was so well done. Like they just really made you believe you were there. And the one scene where the kids are in the cafeteria and Lex is holding the Jello, and it starts to shake because the T-Rex is stomping, and with every step the Jello moves. I mean, you just never gonna forget that. It was just so well done that you had to drop everything and watch it. Like it's one of those movies that watching it back, like my cell phone was down, which says a lot because oftentimes your cell phone's up.
Yes, that's a new movie rating that we can have. So, was it a cell phone up movie or a cell phone down movie?
This is the cell phone down movie because like the action it's so good you don't want to miss any of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to pause the movie because I had to join a meeting, but it happened to be right around where the Raptors, like it's like we've reached the point where Ellie is trying to go turn the electricity on. It's like I knew the Raptors were going to be in the story now, and I was like afraid to turn the movie back on. I was like, I'm scared of these Raptors. Which goes back to my dad was right. The movie's too scary for me.
It's so funny you telling that story because I feel like the book is a lot more terrorful. Like there's just a lot more death for sure, and even the threat of the animals. Like in the movie, we kind of get our parts with each of them, right? Like we get our Dilophosaur, we get our T-Rex, we get our. But I feel like in the book, it's like they keep coming back. Like there's like multiple T-Rex scenes where it's like, oh, we thought we've escaped him, but now we have to deal with the T-Rex on the river. Now we have to deal with the T-Rex at the waterfall. We have to deal with the Raptors multiple times. And so I feel like the threat of death and actual death like happens so much more in the book where, yeah, it's equally, if not more terrifying than watching the movie because there's just so much more that happens and way more of the characters don't make it. Just pterodactyls. And even the compies, which end up eating Hammond in the book. I feel like the book starts with them and also ends with them. Like they kind of feel like the grounding dinosaur in this story. But I don't remember them being in the film at all, unless I just didn't recognize them.
No, they are.
Yeah. They weren't.
The compies are my favorite. I love Hammond being eaten by the compies. It is like the most delicious part of the
compies would agree.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing about the movie is the music, which it wasn't until I started playing the DVD and I was like, oh, the music. Now, I wasn't in band, but my sister was, and my high school band, like that music, every band played that music. Did you have that experience too?
Don't think our school did. But yeah, you hear the music for Jurassic Park and it's like you're just ready to strap in for the ride. Like it just brings you back to, oh, I'm about to watch this movie. And I mean, definitely happy thoughts for me because I love the kind of like thriller and like what's gonna happen next anticipation. So yeah, I think the music for that movie was spot on.
Like everybody watched it and everybody knows the music. When you start playing Eye of the Tiger, you think of Rocky, and when you play this music, you think of Jurassic Park, or you think of My Heart Will Go On, or Don't Want to Miss a Thing. You think of Titanic or Armageddon. Like I feel like you don't. Maybe I'm just not thinking of them right now, but I can't think of movies in the past 10 or 15 years where it's like everybody's watched it and there's some musical piece of it that is like forever connected to that film. Even movies that are really popular, like, you know, your Oppenheimer or what have you, like it isn't the same sort of all-encompassing spectacle where it's a part of your Happy Meal at McDonald's and it's, you know, they're talking about it on MTV when you watch TRL, and it's like it was literally everywhere. You go to a baseball game and they're playing Jurassic Park music. It's just like everything was encompassed in everything else. And I think our culture is a lot more subgenred now, to the point where like you don't have that interwoven connection the same way that you would have with a movie like Jurassic Park.
Any final thoughts on the book Jurassic Park?
I had a lot of fun with this book. Like I said, I never read it before, but at first, like I said, the exposition takes a little bit of a while. I wasn't bored by any measure, but it was kind of just like, okay, like they're giving us more of the thinking behind the park and who are all the people that are involved and who's being affected. But once he starts ramping up the action, it really goes, and it is definitely a page turner. So I had a lot of fun reading this book.
Yeah, I agree. I was into it from the very beginning. Having the little girl on the island getting bit by this lizard-like thing, and I was like, oh my god, is the little girl gonna die like right off the bat? Like it really had me invested very quickly. And Hammond, I mean, yeah, he went into Hammond. He was a lot more negligent than he was in the movie. Like I feel like in the movie we didn't really care for him, but after reading the book, I was like, oh, justice was served at the end because this guy. I had a lot of fun with it. I mean, it's very easy to read in the sense that you just want to see where it's going, and they take their time to explain everything, so you don't feel like you're lost. And like this is coming from someone with no science background. I was an English major in undergrad, which means science is not my thing, and I was a little like, oh no, they're gonna get too technical in here, but no, they didn't really. They explained everything in a way that someone who, like me as a layperson could understand it and enjoy it. This was a very strong read for me. I enjoyed every moment of it.
I'm so glad. It's nice to revisit a book that you loved when you were a kid and find that it isn't terrible, right? It holds up. So definitely still love this book. And I strongly recommend the sequel, The Lost World. The movie, The Lost World, is not nearly as good, and the book is pretty interesting, continues some of the philosophical questions that we touched on. So I enjoyed that book too. Listeners, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say I'll have to add that book to my TBR.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't sink to the bottom. Yeah. Listeners, what did you think of Jurassic Park? Have you read any books by Michael Crichton? You can comment on my Substack at bookclubpod.com. You can also contact me on Twitter. I'm one of those tweeps at book_club_pod, and on Threads at CRoseJack. Also, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help new listeners find the show. The Book Club podcast is produced by me, Carly Jackson. Music and audio production by Alex Marcus. Special thanks to Andreen and Joelle. Be sure to check out the Rewind Rewatch podcast, and you can find a link to their episode on Jurassic Park in the show notes. Thank you for listening.